Hello, welcome to Scratching the Surface. My name's Kamron. I'm a social work student at the University of Toronto, and I'm doing my practicum placement this summer at Recalibrate Therapeutic Services. In this video, I'll be covering grief and loss, its impact on mental and physical health, and I'll be exploring the relevant research literature on how grief and loss manifests and some treatment approaches. So let's get into it. Here's my presentation on grief and loss, bereavement, mourning, and the grieving process. And the first thing we'll do is define some of these terms. We can start by defining grief. Grief is an emotional experience that is brought about by loss. Grieving is often portrayed as extreme sadness, coupled with a longing to be with that person again, or in other cases, to have those things in your life again. The outward expression of grief is called mourning, which can take the form of crying, artwork, so some may engage in artistic endeavors to honor the person or the thing that they lost, or rituals and religious practices. Very often, religious communities serve as a vital source of support for individuals and families who are grieving. Anticipatory grief is when, for example, someone has been diagnosed with a terminal illness and their family is anticipating that their time is going to come sooner or later. For the family members who are experiencing anticipatory grief, they may experience the same symptoms as someone who is grieving a deceased family member. Disenfranchised grief is in response to losses that go unacknowledged or unsupported by mainstream society. For example, losing a pet, losing a job, or having a family member or loved one who is experiencing cognitive decline and who may not be acting themselves anymore. So they may be physically present but not psychologically. Next, we can define loss, and CAMH provides a pretty good list of what may constitute a loss in the context of grieving. The first one on this list is loved ones, and this is by far the most recognized source of grieving. When most people think of grief or grieving, they think you may have lost a loved one like a family member or close friend. Second on the list here is job or career, and many people may identify very strongly with their job or career. It may be a source of confidence for them, it may be the only source of income for them, and they may never feel the same if they're laid off or fired, or if they're forced to have to leave that position due to personal circumstances. Third on the list is relationships or friendships, and the first thing that may come to mind is divorce or breakups, even friend breakups, especially if the couple relied on each other for emotional support or financial support, or sharing kids and losing access to the kids possibly, and even losing the status of being married and going back to singlehood. Academic loss may refer to losses over the course of an academic journey, such as loss of a placement, failures in school, or being unable to attend conventional celebrations such as prom or graduation. Next on the list is rituals or routines, and this may refer to someone having moved places and having to adapt to a new place that doesn't have the same community or atmosphere as the place they came from. As well, if someone has experienced an accident like a workplace injury, or they've been seriously assaulted and they lose their ability in their legs or arms, for example, then they may not be able to do the same things as before and they have to adapt to their new normal. Finally on this list is mental health support or professional assistance, and you could imagine a person who sees the same doctor or therapist over a long period of time may feel certain emotions when that doctor or therapist has to retire or move places, and the person has to get accustomed to finding someone else who can provide them with the same level of care. They may feel that they will never get the same treatment as they did before with their previous doctor or therapist. So in response to these losses, one may react in a number of ways, and I've put some of the most common reactions on this slide. So they may include denial, shock, guilt, anger or frustration, struggling to eat, sleep, or engage in usual activities, trouble concentrating, and feelings of anxiety, physical changes such as headaches, stomach aches, dizziness, and nausea. And a lot of these symptoms actually overlap with other mental health conditions, and we're going to get into some of those co-occurring mental health conditions on a later slide. So you may be wondering, is it possible to grieve for too long? And a team of researchers for the National Library of Medicine in the United States claim that most bereaved persons adapt over 6 months to a year, and factors such as adequate social support, advantageous socioeconomic positions, and personal resilience tend to work in affected persons' favor, while the absence of such may increase risk for prolonged grief disorder. So according to the most current edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, one may be diagnosed diagnosed with prolonged grief disorder if it's been a year since the loss of a loved one, 6 months for children or adolescents, and they are still experiencing at least 3 of the symptoms nearly every day for at least the last month prior to diagnosis. Some of the symptoms include identity disruption, disbelief of the loss, avoidance of reminders of the loss, intense emotional pain relating to the loss, difficulty with reintegration, so difficulty getting back into one's usual activities, emotional numbness, and feeling that life is meaningless and experiencing intense loneliness without that person or that thing in their life. And as I mentioned before, there are co-occurring mental health conditions with prolonged grief disorder. Some of them include major depressive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, especially if the loss may have been violent or sudden, the person may experience flashbacks. Substance use disorder, they may turn to substances to forget or relieve the pain associated with the loss. Generalized anxiety disorder, so maybe the person or the thing that they lost was a source of security or confidence for them, and without it they become more anxious. Panic disorders, and eating disorders. So getting into the research literature, some of the qualitative articles talk about some interesting types of losses, and the first one on this list is ambiguous loss of singlehood. The article described ambiguous loss as when a loved one may be physically present but not psychologically. So an example of that is someone who may be succumbing to their addictions, or they may be mentally and cognitively declining, or they may be too preoccupied with other things that keep them from engaging socially, such as video games, television, and other forms of media. Another form of ambiguous loss is when someone may be psychologically present but not physically. And examples of this can include a loved one who has been incarcerated, a loved one who may have disappeared due to kidnapping or natural disasters, and the example which is the topic of this article, which is singlehood. So the author in this article contends that if someone is hoping for a romantic relationship and they have an idea of who their partner should be, but that person never materializes or never shows up, then they may be in a constant state of grieving a loved one who may be psychologically present but not physically. The article also goes over the potential benefits and consequences of settling, so settling for a partner who may not live up to one's expectations of who they want a partner to be, and the ambiguous loss of children, in this case being children that a person may hope for but may never materialize because they're not able to find a partner satisfying enough to have children with. It's an interesting article, and ambiguous loss is one of those disenfranchised sources of grief where one may not feel supported or recognized for what they're grieving, in this case being singlehood. Another article covered job loss related complicated grief symptoms, where the article provided realistic scenarios where people lost their jobs or lost their careers, and with it lost their sense of identity or their confidence, and started experiencing symptoms similar to prolonged grief disorder, where they kept yearning and thinking about their previous career, which stopped them from gaining a fulfilling career or job in the future after that. I think this article is significant because prolonged grief disorder only applies to someone who's lost a loved one and doesn't apply to someone who's lost a job. But it's easy to imagine that someone who's lost a job that they've worked for maybe 15 to 20 years and that they love may experience symptoms that are similar to prolonged grief disorder and stops them from moving on in life. The last sort of qualitative article that I want to share here is about pets and how the loss of a pet can also trigger similar symptoms to prolonged grief disorder. It's unfortunate that the death of a dog or cat or bird or any pet that someone may have had sometimes is taken less seriously than the death of a loved one, even though people may have formed strong emotional bonds with their pet over time, especially when we think about emotional support animals or pets that have seen their owners through very tough times. The loss of a pet can be perceived to be worse than the loss of a person, and the author in this article received such responses from participants in his research. For these reasons, I think that clinicians and practitioners should consider that prolonged grief disorder can also apply to people who have lost their job, their pet, or other ambiguous losses that aren't exactly in the formal definition in the DSM-5. A certain population in the literature on grief and loss that I wanted to share with you in this video are gang and justice-involved youth. I believe as a criminology major in my undergrad that gang members are too often villainized, and the image of gangs are so skewed in the media that we forget that these are human beings at the end of the day that had their needs unmet or went through traumatizing events in their lives that led them to want to join a gang. And joining a gang doesn't necessarily make life easier for these individuals. Many gang members get stabbed, shot, and left to die in the streets for petty conflicts, and the families of these homicide victims are left to grieve while having their grieving process be complicated or interrupted by prolonged criminal legal processes, criminal trials, safety concerns, and mental health challenges. The literature suggests that justice-involved adolescents are more likely to have experienced traumatic losses due to homicide and higher rates of grief compared to the general adolescent population, and this either pulls them closer or pushes them away from gang involvement, depending on if they'd like to get revenge for their loved one, or if the emotions and feelings are too overwhelming and they're unable to engage in their usual activities anymore. In a study exploring gang and justice-involved youth's experiences with grief and traumatic loss, participants reported symptoms that placed them in the clinical range of PTSD, depression, and substance use disorder, which makes sense since some of them have witnessed violent and traumatic incidents firsthand, and being affiliated or having previous affiliation with a gang, or living in an area where gangs are present, facilitates easier access to substances such as marijuana, cocaine, and heroin, which may help alleviate the loss of a loved one. So when we think about the vicious cycle of gang violence, and we consider the human aspect of gang members, we may see it as gang members taking out their grief, anger, and frustration by killing rival gang members, thus feeding into the cycle of violence. So now that we have a decent understanding of grief and loss, we can begin to talk about some treatment options. So in a systematic review and meta-analysis of group-based psychotherapeutic interventions for adults who have experienced prolonged grief symptoms, the findings indicated that structured group interventions, especially cognitive behavioral, dual process, and compassion-focused models, are significantly effective in reducing such symptoms. And this systematic review and meta-analysis only included studies with an eligibility criteria requiring groups that continued for at least 3 sessions, having at least 5 members, addressing adults grieving a lost loved one, and these studies must have been a randomized controlled trial or quasi-experimental design, which are some of the highest standards in research. So we can say with a high level of confidence that group-based psychotherapeutic interventions that use these models of cognitive behavioral therapy, dual process, and compassion-focused therapy are effective in reducing the symptoms of prolonged grief disorder. As well, in a randomized controlled trial comparing the effectiveness of complicated grief therapy to standard interpersonal therapy, it showed that the complicated grief therapy demonstrated a more substantial impact in reducing complicated grief symptoms compared to the interpersonal therapy. The interpersonal therapy was still effective, but the complicated grief therapy was much more focused and showed much more effectiveness in reducing symptoms. That study took place in Pakistan for bereaved adults who lost loved ones to COVID-19. This article also mentioned a modified version of complicated grief therapy for older adults and showed similar effectiveness for them as well. In another study involving a randomized controlled trial examining the impact of music therapy on bereaved individuals, the findings indicated that music therapy, in conjunction with standard psychotherapy, significantly improved grief symptoms compared to standard care alone. And the music therapy consisted of 8 to 10 sessions involving instrumental improvisation, vocal improvisation, and vocal dialogue. And this really reminds me that some people can express their feelings much better through music or through artwork. An example is that the rapper Eminem once created a song dedicated to his friend who was killed in a sudden act of violence, and there are other numerous examples in the hip-hop scene and music scene where artists express their feelings for their deceased loved ones much better through music than they could ever through other means. Another article explored play therapy for traumatic loss, and so the target audience is obviously children, and the article talks about the developmental reactions to traumatic loss for children's ages 2 to 7 and 8 to 11, and their different understandings of death and how to approach children with this idea if they were witnesses or if they experienced a family member or loved one die during their early years, especially since they will have different reactions at different developmental stages of their life, like when they reach adolescence and adulthood. As well, the article talks about termination precautions with traumatic loss loss, since if there's a premature termination initiated by either the parents or the therapist, then this should be addressed with the child to prevent any sort of abandonment issues. And when it comes to compassion-focused grief therapy, compassion can really help an individual who is grieving deal with their shame in a healthy way. For example, some may feel guilty, some may feel like they could have done more for the person who passed away, and feel hard on themselves for that reason. Compassion-focused therapy helps with silencing that inner critic, which may continuously bother a person and keep them from moving on in life. This also ties in with emotional regulation, since feelings of shame and guilt are often primary emotions to anger, and so by having compassion for oneself, they can better soothe their nervous system and keep themselves from reacting in adverse ways. Finally, it's helpful to make a distinction between grief counseling and grief therapy. According to psychologist J. William Worden, there's a difference between these two things. Grief counseling involves helping people facilitate uncomplicated or normal grief towards a healthy adaptation to the tasks of mourning within a reasonable time frame. And family members can do this, community members and religious leaders can do this. But grief therapy involves the specialized therapeutic techniques employed by highly trained and skilled individuals to help bereaved individuals work through the particularly problematic mediators that often lead to complicated mourning. And in the article discussing the distinction, some reactions to grief that warrant grief therapy include chronic grief. So this is when symptoms of prolonged grief disorder are present. There's delayed grief, which is when someone may have experienced a loss, but then later down the road, there's another traumatizing event which reminds them of that loss, and then they begin grieving at that moment. There's exaggerated grief, which means that someone may be experiencing severe and intense symptoms of grief during a supposedly normal time frame of bereavement. And as well, there's masked grief, which means that someone may think that they've gotten over their grief, but actually, when it comes to their professional lives or academic lives or otherwise, they're performing poorly in response to the loss. But they're not initially attributing it to the loss, and they don't know that the loss is affecting them in this way. But a final note is that it's always helpful to see a therapist, especially if you don't have adequate social supports. When there are social supports, you often have people checking in on you, but when you don't, you often have to take it upon yourself to reach out for support, even if that means admitting weakness. Sometimes admitting weakness is the strongest thing you can do at times like these. But that's just scratching the surface. If you'd like to learn more about grief and loss, I've put the sources for this video in the description below. And if you or someone you know is grieving a lost loved one, a pet, a career, or some intangible loss, then don't hesitate to reach out to Recalibrate Therapeutic Services, where the experienced mental health practitioners can help you with non-judgmental and compassionate care. That's all for now. I hope you learned something, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.